The remarkable colleagues from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations are celebrating an anniversary. The question arises, to what degree is the intellectual product they create?
Very, very useful. Our ministry has traditionally close relations with all our research institutes that deal with foreign policy and foreign economic issues. Under the Minister of Foreign Affairs, this tradition began long before my time. There is a scientific council, which includes the heads of our leading institutes and, of course, the heads of IMEMO. The relations are explained primarily by mutual benefit. Practical diplomacy must, of course, rely on our traditions. These are extraordinarily rich, going back to the Russian Empire, and even before that, to the times of Ivan the Terrible, the ambassadorial office. But of course, practical diplomacy, while being very interested in analytical developments, cannot manage this work on its own, alone, because the everyday hustle and bustle that is present on the international stage one way or another is distracting. Just today's events alone are enough. They simply force one to devote all one's working time entirely to current affairs, to relations with countries that are involved in these conflicts, and so on. Whereas our colleagues from scientific institutes have, after all, one main task: to analyze what is happening. Therefore, we are interested in their calm analysis, not burdened or undermined by the day-to-day grind, and they are interested in the factual conclusions that we can pass on to them, based on specific situations in one or another part of the globe where Russian interests clash. So for us, this is a very important and significant connection. Situational analyses, brainstorming sessions, which we conduct in addition to meetings of the Scientific Council, they allow us to find very interesting solutions. Incidentally, these situational analyses were introduced into practice by none other than Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, who, in his subsequent senior government positions after he had headed IMEMO, very productively promoted all these methods of his, and they still retain their relevance to this day.
Tell me, in today's world, which you describe as having gone mad, is science capable of helping you in practical diplomacy? Is it able to grasp today's situation?
As for how capable anyone is of grasping today's situation, I think no one is fully capable of that. No one can manage it alone. It's not a single country, not one state, and certainly not one part of some state, in this case science. But that science genuinely helps our work. That I can confirm. Incidentally, IMEMO, we are now talking about the anniversary of this great institute. IMEMO was most actively involved in the preparation of all editions and concepts of the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, starting from the year 2000. And this tradition continues. And if someday it becomes necessary to prepare new additional doctrinal documents, we will very much count on the help of our colleagues from IMEMO, as was the case with the outstanding representatives of that institute: Nikolai Nikolaevich Kosolapov, Alexander Alexandrovich Dinkin, Alexei Georgievich Arbatov. These are all our very distinguished colleagues and in many ways co-authors of our foreign policy doctrines.
A question I've long wanted to ask. Tell me, when speaking of the art of Russian diplomacy, could you describe what that is today? Is there some kind of art to it?
Well, there is. First of all, it is all written down for us in the doctrinal documents of the same foreign policy concept. The task set there is to work above all on defending our national interests, while respecting the interests of others, while respecting the interests of those countries that are prepared to work with us on an equal, mutually respectful basis, and to seek a balance of those very interests, something that the West categorically lacks. And in particular, we are now observing how the Trump administration openly declares we do not want to know anything about international law. We have our own morality, we have our own instincts, and those are what we will be guided by. Therefore, national interests, mutual respect, understanding, the desire and ability to understand the legitimate approaches of your partner, your interlocutor, and of course, pragmatism. Diplomacy, like politics, any politics, is the art of the possible, and one must proceed from that. President of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin has said on numerous occasions, including in relation to the Ukrainian crisis, that our tasks have been set, they were clearly formulated, and everyone knows, we have repeated this many times, what goals we are pursuing within the framework of the special military operation. And at the same time we understand that an agreement involving more than one party inevitably implies compromises, but compromises that will not affect the core security interests of the Russian Federation in this case, and that will take into account the core interests of Russians, Russian speakers, and all those who represent Donbass, Novorossiya, Crimea, those who found themselves in a position of being discriminated against and declared terrorists after the coup d'etat in 2014. Therefore, diplomacy must be principled. It must be clear in terms of its goals. Right now, the European Union, some figures there, I don't remember who, have begun saying, well, let's see at some stage. Not now, but later. We will have to talk with Russia anyway, to clarify its red lines and show our own red lines. This is simply not serious, and it is no kind of diplomacy. It is a form of racism, to a certain degree, which implies a dismissive attitude toward the partner, in this case, toward the Russian Federation. Because to say that they need to clarify our red lines, well, that is laughable. They were designated long ago. And to say that the EU in this situation wants to explain its red lines to us, that is simply of no interest, because the European Union was an active participant in the agreements on the settlement of the Maidan crisis in Ukraine in February 2014. Germany, France, and Poland guaranteed the agreement. Those who carried out the coup d'etat spat on it, and they simply washed their hands of it. The European Union was also a most active participant, with its red lines, in the Minsk agreements of February 2015, which were approved by the UN Security Council. And then later, the EU itself, through the mouths of Merkel, Hollande, with the support of Poroshenko, all three of whom, together with the President of Russia, signed those Minsk agreements, declared that they never intended to fulfill anything. They lied to us, they said, in essence. We needed to deceive you. Forgive the coarse word, but that is precisely what they meant. In order to buy time, to pump Ukraine full of weapons. Therefore, no red lines, no explanations from us to the European Union are needed. Those there who know how to hear and listen, they should have understood everything long ago. If, however, the issue is that certain representatives of the elites are promoting their entirely self-serving, unrealistic, illusory goals, well, God is their judge. History will teach them, probably a little later. But the task of diplomacy, as I have already said, is to defend national interests while respecting the interests of worthy, decent partners. Well, you know, if we move briefly into the realm of humor, do you remember that series of jokes about Armenian radio in the Soviet Union? So Armenian radio was asked, what is diplomacy? Well, they answered, there are several versions, but the most decent one is, diplomacy is the art of sending a person where they belong, but doing it in such a way that they look forward to the trip. So that, too, can be placed in the arsenal of diplomatic methods. There is nothing unusual about it.
Everyone is terribly curious. Negotiations take place behind closed doors. How does this process work? What is the art of it? Is it about penetrating your partner, figuring them out, or doing something else? Reveal a few small secrets.
You know, there is no single general rule about what the art consists of. Every negotiation is individual. It depends greatly, if not decisively, on the personalities of the participants in the negotiations, on how erudite these people are, on how much they possess the qualities that we particularly value in the Russian diplomatic service. Excellent command of foreign languages, knowledge of history, knowledge of the regions, the parts of the world, the countries that you work on, and that you are discussing in a given situation. American negotiators, as a rule, do not necessarily have these qualities. I will put it that way. We had something called area studies, where a person was trained for diplomacy through deep immersion in the country, the history, the culture, the region that this person would deal with in the diplomatic service. For Americans, it is all different. Then, in our system, a person goes on an overseas posting for an average of about 5 years. This allows one to settle in, get up to speed, and produce output in the form of recommendations and ideas over a sustained period. For Americans, it is 2 to 3 years, and that is it. A person might be transferred from Indonesia to Congo, then to Guatemala, and so on. That is their tradition. That is a feature of their diplomatic service, and we treat it with respect. But for productive negotiations, it is of course very important to understand the subject matter, especially when such deep-rooted problems are being discussed, problems with a history of decades or even centuries, as in the history of the Middle East. In the Middle East, simply to slash through things at once, I've put forward a proposal, agree before it's too late, that will never work. And what is now essentially happening, the attempt to simply consign all UN resolutions on Palestine to oblivion and forget about the creation of a Palestinian state. Well, it might work if achieved by force, as we are observing in Gaza and on the west bank of the Jordan River. It will drive this problem underground for a time, but it will go nowhere. It will explode again. It will be a time bomb once more. Because the injustice toward the Palestinians, toward those numerous UN decisions on the necessity of creating 2 states, only half of those decisions have been implemented. And this injustice is very widely felt in the Arab world, especially on the Arab street. And likewise, it is impossible to deal with the problems that someone has with the Islamic Republic of Iran without immersing oneself in the history of this civilization, one of the most ancient civilizations, and without understanding that there is also such a trait in many peoples as national pride, which they are not prepared to surrender in exchange for any promised material benefits. Therefore, the success of negotiations depends on many factors, but among them, besides an understanding of the historical root causes of one or another conflict situation, personal chemistry, as they say, plays a significant role, and it helped me if we are speaking of my experience. Perhaps this was most vividly manifested in my relations with John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, and when we had occasion to work together. Well, incidentally, one of the first issues was the Ukrainian problem, because in February 2014, having trampled upon the agreements signed by the parties, by President Yanukovych, and by the opposition, with the mediation and guarantees of the European Union, the putschists came to power. Then came the referendum in Crimea, whose residents, just like the residents of Donbass refuse to live under an illegitimate authority, especially under an authority that had declared its intention to abolish the status of the Russian language. All of that was already happening at the time, that declared the residents of Crimea terrorists, that sent fighters to storm the Verkhovna Rada of Crimea. And in April, about a month, I suppose, after the date we mark in these March days, about a month later, we gathered at John Kerry's suggestion in Geneva. John Kerry, your humble servant, the senior official for foreign policy in the European Union, I don't remember who it was at the time, but there was some lady, I think an English woman. I won't recall, unfortunately, perhaps it doesn't matter. And there was at that time the acting head of the foreign policy establishment of Ukraine. Under the putschists, Mr. Deshkitsia, he later went off somewhere as an ambassador. But the four of us sat together and worked. We prepared a document. And incidentally, the atmosphere was a normal, working one. It seemed that everyone was interested in somehow straightening out this situation and not allowing it to degrade into a final bloody hot crisis. And at that time, a draft of about a page and a half was developed, but it contained things that, in that situation, could, of course, have solved the problem. And the main element of this draft was the recognition of the rights of all regions, all oblasts of Ukraine, to form a federal state. Well, recognition of the right of regions to contribute to the life of Ukraine and to determining the path of its development. And as the means toward achieving this goal, the concept of federalization was agreed upon. And who knows, if that document had ultimately been approved and had formed the basis for practical action, perhaps many problems could have been avoided. But you remember that Poroshenko, who, like Zelensky incidentally, came to power under the slogans of a peacemaker, under the slogans of ending the war, under the slogans of respecting the rights of all residents of Ukraine, including, of course, Russians, he, in the end, was compelled, whether they forced him or whether he had been harboring such a thought himself, he was compelled to declare that there could be no question of any federalization whatsoever. And from that point onward, foaming at the mouth, both he and after him Zelensky, they have defended and continue to defend the unitary structure of the Ukrainian state, which in their execution translates simply into a Nazi regime that is the only one in the world to have banned an entire language on its territory in all spheres of the life and activity of the state, not to mention the canonical Orthodox Church. But the agreement, it had been reached. It was then reported to the leadership, and apparently those Ukrainian Nazis who had seized power categorically rejected this practically agreed-upon text, just as they also wrecked an agreement that had likewise been reached. This is no longer my experience. This is already the experience of our current negotiators, led by Vladimir Medinsky, when, after several rounds of negotiations in Belarus and in Istanbul, a fundamental agreement was reached in Istanbul on a document that the Ukrainians had presented, in which there were security guarantees both for Ukraine and for Russia, collective guarantees, not unilateral ones as the Europeans are now trying to impose. And there too were guarantees that Ukraine would never be a bloc country, and guarantees for the Russian language were there as well. But you see, they were forbidden from accepting that document. So it is not uncommon for a good, well-crafted approach to one or another critical situation to then be wrecked by politicians acting from their own self-serving, momentary motives. And with John Kerry, There is probably one more good example, and it was an even more advanced one. That was when the Syrian story began in 2013, when Obama, then President of the United States, wanted to begin a war against Syria, accusing it of concealing its chemical program. And so Kerry and I spent many hours together and ultimately reached. Our president communicated with Obama at an event that took place in Petersburg, the G20, I believe it was, and there it was agreed that Russia would do everything to ensure that no one had any doubts about the absence of chemical weapons in Syria. We persuaded our Syrian colleagues. They officially renounced and submitted their positions to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Kerry and I worked out a UN Security Council resolution that enshrined all of this. But then, after all, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which received, incidentally, the Nobel Peace Prize for that episode in 2013, it has now spat on all of that and is once again accusing the Syrians, even under the previous regime, of being covered in it. Why this is necessary, I do not know. But the point I am making, forgive me for such lengthy examples. My point is that there is such a factor as personal relations. I had very good relations with John Kerry. We communicated an enormous number of times each year, and this helped to reach agreements. But far from always did it then prove possible to actually implement those agreements, even when they were approved by a UN Security Council resolution.
What is happening in the world right now? Does it seem to you like something that has already happened before? Are we simply developing along a spiral, as Marx said, and periodically colliding with such madness? Or is this something new that has fallen upon us?
History develops in a spiral. Another evaluative point, they say history repeats itself in the form of farce. One can have different attitudes when it repeats, but the fact that the current situation is serious, this is far from farce. Because despite all the outward manifestations of farce, and they are present, I think many people understand this. The consequences of what our American colleagues are doing, in this case, together with the Israelis, are extremely grave and will reverberate for a very, very long time. And in general, we are witnessing a stage of our history that returns us along the spiral, but returns us back to a world where there were no frameworks at all for international relations, no Versailles system, no Yalta system, nothing, where might is right. Whereas for us, as you know, it is not in force that God resides, but in truth, to use the words of the well-known hero from the well-known film. But look at what is happening now. The United States has officially declared that no one can tell them what to do. They care only about their own well-being, and they are prepared to defend that well-being by any means. Coup d'etat, the assassination of leaders of those countries that possess natural resources the Americans need, or kidnappings, Venezuela, Iran. They no longer conceal it, our American colleagues. It is about oil. They have a doctrine of dominance over global energy markets. And so, Lukoil, Rosneft, they have come under sanctions. These are already the first major sanctions of the Trump administration. Not Biden's legacy. They have cut Europe off categorically. You see, the Nord Streams. Long ago, even when the Nord Streams were being built, the Americans were in favor of Europe abandoning them. But now it has turned out that Europe has been denied the Nord Streams, and Germany was humiliated, as in fact everyone understands this. But what is the result? Now the Hungarians and the Slovaks are fighting with their last strength. defending their interests in maintaining cheap, accessible energy resources as the engine of their economies. And they are being told, no, buy at twice the price, because Russia must be punished. But that is no approach to international relations. This is an attempt to return to the colonial era, when Europe, which is now engaged in all of this, forcing Hungary and Slovakia and any other dissenters to simply obey those who give orders in Brussels, without having ever been elected by anyone, anywhere, unlike national governments. Europe, which for 500 years ruled the entire world during the era of colonialism and slavery and is now trying to entrench neo-colonialism in the world, it still wants to live at the expense of others and to dictate to everyone. The arrogance, the contempt for everyone else. It simply pours, forgive me, out of today's European politicians when they start moralizing. And the United States has welcomed and continues to welcome the marginalization of Russia on European energy markets, and in Serbia, they are pushing us out. That is already the Americans. Biden started it. Trump is finishing it. And this is an open claim to dominance. The goal is energy dominance across the entire world, in all regions. And therefore, when our American colleagues say to us, well, let's resolve the Ukraine issue now, and we are ready for that, as we were even in Alaska, they are now beginning to waver somewhat. But they say, let's resolve it. Look, there are places where concessions can be made, and then such enormous economic prospects will open up between us. While in parallel, what I have just described to you is happening. We are being pushed out of all energy markets worldwide, and in the end, only our own territory will remain. The Americans will come to us. We are in favor of cooperation with them. But if we are ready to implement mutually beneficial projects on our territory and to provide the Americans with what interests them, taking into account our interests as well, then our interests beyond the borders of Russia's own wealth must also be respected. So far, we do not see this. Therefore, this is an unusual situation, a return to a time when there were no frameworks for international relations whatsoever. It has been stated directly, the interests of the United States prevail over any international agreements.
Sergey Viktorovich, is this a generation that will pass, or is there some kind of turning point ahead?
I am not an astrologer and not a fortune teller. Probably much depends on the personal characteristics of those who come to power and on how much the elected leaders are supported by their voters throughout the entire term of their governance.
One final question. Russian diplomacy was once oriented toward partnership primarily with Europe, then with the United States, and now?
Even since the time of the Russian Empire, it was recognized that there are only two allies, the army and the navy. But now, of course, we must also include the aerospace forces. We cannot ignore them. And we also now have new troops of unmanned aerial vehicles, so our allies will be more numerous. But the main conclusion from our 1,000-year history is, trust in God, but don't slip up yourself. And that, too, is very important. One can hope only in God, but one must not slip up oneself. On allies, on like-minded partners, of course one must rely on them, one must help them, one must receive with gratitude the support they give you. With those who have deceived you more than once, well, one must also build relations in a biblical sense, based on the understanding that these are not people you can trust. Therefore, the President has said on numerous occasions, the weak get beaten. And that is really all there is to it. One must be strong. Russia is a very strong country, strong in spirit, the strongest country in terms of its natural resources, its scientific potential. One only needs to be able to translate all of this into the technologies that would today be at the very highest level, including, as the president has said, whoever leads in the sphere of artificial intelligence will be the leader of the world. So we want our diplomacy to help create the conditions for achieving precisely such results as those outlined by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.